Hello, friends. Happy Halloween. I hope you are doing well. I hope you are staying safe from all of the dark creatures outside who are unleashed on this night. Those magical beings which are strange to us, are threatening to us, who ride forth. Stay away from them. Do not be seen, or you may be taken, you may be kidnapped, you may have your memory blanked out, or something worse. Today, I want to bring to you a story that I have found quite a little while ago about a spooky occurrence which took place over 900 years ago in the town of Berwick upon Tweed. This story was recounted by William of Newburgh. He was a monk and a historian, writing in the 12th century, and he produced a book which is the History of English Affairs, dating between 1066 and 1198. So the period from the reign of William the Conqueror, William the First of the Norman invasion, up to, for him, the present day, moving through the anarchy, which nearly saw the collapse of French rule in England, and onwards into the formation of a genuine Englishness in the reigns of figures like Henry II. William was very interested in cases of revenants. Now, revenant is a old French word. It means something like returning or to return. And a revenant is a kind of ghostly figure with a corporeal form. It is somebody who comes back from the dead. We might see a similarity with the Norse Draugr or Draugr, which again is a corporeal body coming back to life. This isn't a mindless zombie, though. They tend to be able to speak, to have conversations, to be intentional, and to act in certain ways. They can cause great damage to people, indeed, terrifying and killing. They can often invade homes, maybe to see a loved one from a previous life, or to terrorize others. The Revenant and Draugr have, in the Victorian era and onwards, often been compared to vampires. And this was particularly a figure called Andrew Lang, who was very influential in the study of fairy tales and folklore, made this connection. And it isn't so much in terms of the blood sucking nature of a vampire. The Revenant or Draugr does not share this quality. However, it is the contagious nature of these beings. A vampire, when it bites its victim, when it sucks blood from them, eventually they will die and then be turned into a vampire themselves. For a revenant or a Draugr, there was this idea that actually they brought disease or a contagion into the place where they were. And indeed, that may be the main threat that this corpse poses to a community. And so, like the vampire, they turn others into their own undead nature. William of Newburgh wrote extensively upon revenants. He recounted several tales of revenants within living memory taking place in England and the borders with Scotland. And this was quite important to him in terms of how he approached history. He contrasted himself with a figure like Geoffrey of Monmouth. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote The History of the Kings of Britain, and it is one of the most influential medieval histories that was produced at that period. Indeed, it was like wildfire. It was extremely popular. There are hundreds of manuscripts all around Europe because the courts of Europe were eating this up. It told a kind of mythical rendition of the history of Britain in terms of the original Britons being the descendants of the refugees or those who fled Troy after it was destroyed in the Iliad by the Achaeans, by the Greeks. And then moving forwards, it is the first substantial telling of the Arthurian mythos as we have it today. The tale of how Arthur rises up, leads a group of knights to establish a just and good kingdom, extends this across Europe, conquering all the way through the Holy Roman Empire. And then is brought down by his nephew Mordred. He is mortally wounded and carried to the Isle of Avalon. This would become the framework within which the rest of the Arthurian romances, such as those by Chrétien de Troyes, about Lancelot, about Percival, the Holy Grail, Excalibur being brought into it, these all find their origin point, their inspiration in Geoffrey's work. But Newberer was highly critical of Geoffrey of Monmouth. He argued that the book, The History of the Kings of Britain, only a person ignorant of ancient history would have any doubt about how shamelessly and impudently Geoffrey of Monmouth lies in almost everything. He was not a fan at all. He thought that Geoffrey fabricated the Arthurian story, and this was demonstrated by the fact that his accounts of events conflict with other historians, such as the Venerable Bedes. And so Newberer was trying to establish things with multiple sources who were close to the events. And so when he comes to the subject of revenants, again, supernatural creatures, creatures who are magical, belonging to another world almost, the realm of the dead, breaking into our own, then he's going to try and show this, that these things are real, by citing lots of accounts of this. And one of these took place in the town of Berwick upon Tweed. And so I thought it would be fun on this Halloween to read to you William and Newberer's account of the Revenant of Berwick. So, let us begin. In the northern parts of England, also, we know that another event, not unlike this and equally wonderful, that is, the event he's just described in the previous chapter, happened about the same time. At the mouth of the River Tweed, and in the jurisdiction of the King of Scotland, there stands a noble city which is called Berwick. In this town, a certain man, very wealthy, but as it afterwards appeared, a great rogue, having been buried, after his death sallied forth, by the contrivance, as it is believed, of Satan, out of his grave by night, and was borne hither and thither, pursued by a pack of dogs with loud barkings, thus striking great terror into the neighbours, and returning to his tomb before daylight. After this had continued for several days, and no one dared to be found out of doors after dusk, for each dreaded an encounter with this deadly monster, the higher and middle classes of the people held a necessary investigation into what was requisite to be done, the more simple among them fearing, in the event of negligence, to be soundly beaten by this prodigy of the grave, but the wiser shrewdly concluding that there were a remedy further delayed, the atmosphere infected and corrupted by the constant whirlings through it of the pestiferous corpse would engender disease and death to a great extent, the necessity of providing against which was shown by frequent examples in similar cases. They, therefore, procured 10 young men, renowned for boldness, who were to dig up the horrible carcass, and, having cut it limb from limb, reduce it into food and fuel for the flames. When this was done, the commotion ceased. Moreover, it is stated that the monster, while it was being borne about, as it is said, by Satan, had told certain persons whom it had by chance encountered, that as long as it remained unburned, the people should have no peace. Being burnt, tranquillity appeared to be restored to them, but a pestilence, which arose in consequence, carried off the greater portion of them, for never did it so furiously rage elsewhere, though it was at that time general throughout all the borders of England, as shall be more fully explained in its proper place. It would not be easy to believe that the corpses of the dead should sally, I know not by what agency, from their graves, and should wander about to the terror or destruction of the living, and again return to the tomb, which of its own accord spontaneously opened to receive them, Did not frequent examples occurring in our own times suffice to establish this fact, to the truth of which there is abundant testimony? It would be strange if such things should have happened formerly, since we can find no evidence of them in the works of ancient authors, whose vast labour it was to commit to writing every occurrence worthy of memory. For if they never neglected to register even events of moderate interest, how could they have suppressed a fact at once so amazing and horrible, supposing it to have happened in their day? Moreover, were I to write down all the instances of this kind which I have ascertained to have befallen our times, the undertaking would be beyond measure laborious and troublesome. So I will fain add two more only, and these of recent occurrence, to those I have already narrated, and insert them in our history as occasion offers, as a warning to posterity. So, what's interesting here? Well, there's a couple of things that I want to draw our attention to. Firstly, Newborough's account, we have uh, a zombie-like figure, a revenant, a droga, a corpse coming back to life, but it is clearly not a resurrection. It is not somebody who's been resuscitated. It's not somebody who has new life or eternal life in them. This is a corpse, a rotting corpse, wandering the streets of Berwick, so much so that the dogs, the animals, are instinctively afraid of it. They bark at it. They want it gone. They recognize that it's unnatural. Now, one of the interesting things in this is Newborough consistently says that it is said that Satan was the one who was acting through this revenant. He does not say that explicitly. He does not say Satan was the agent. He says it is said that Satan was the agent. And indeed, he says in that later part after the story that he does not know what caused them to move about. And this is kind of interesting because it's very easy to think in a post Protestant Reformation mindset that you have God and the angels who are good supernatural beings, and then everything else is under the rule of Satan and opposed to these realities. And so there's this kind of dualism going on. Certainly, both Protestant and Catholic theologians push towards that direction in the 1500s. Whereas in the medieval mindset, the world was populated by a vast array of magical beings. Some of these were servants of God, some of these were servants of Satan, but there was this vast middle area of the fairies. And fairies, by fairies, I do not mean like a Tinkerbell, a 19th century cute little woman in a dress with wings. No, a fairy covers all manner of magical being. It could be like the elves in the Lord of the Rings, to goblins, to little brownies who were little kind of gnome-like spirits who would tend to your uh, keeping your house tidy. It could be monsters who lurk in forests and lakes, in the oceans, all manner of things. And these fairies could be good or bad. Indeed, perhaps good or bad is the wrong words to use. They have a different morality to human beings. They have a different way of being. It's almost like an alien relationship. And they belong to another world, a magical world, often associated with being underground. And thus there is often a crossover or a tie-in between the fairy and the dead, both being different realms, the otherworld, the underworld. For example, fairies living under hills. You have the dead buried in barrows or in under hills as well. And many of these dead are in the kind of folklore and mythology may come back, such as a Draugr, or as a ghost, or a Bian Nai, or a Banshee. So what's interesting here is, okay, there's this ambivalent category of the fairy, but William is quite clear that many people are calling this revenant a servant of Satan. There is no neutrality about this. There is no ambiguity. It's not in the middle. It's actually a servant of Satan. And this is in part because it is unnatural, it is inflicting great evil within the world, and it is fundamentally against the laws of God. This man should remain dead. Now, of course, William mentions that this merchant, who is the body, the corpse that's come back to life, he seems to have been a rogue, and in some way, the evilness of this man was a gateway for Satan to enter his heart. It was a means by which he could take control of him and animate him once more. And this idea gets carried on and is indeed there in Scripture. There is this idea that Satan tempts, and if one gives into the temptation in some way, you're allowing Satan into you. And I don't mean that in a metaphorical sense. Early modern, medieval, ancient peoples didn't have the same boundary between themselves and the world. They recognized that things can influence us and indeed even enter into us as we can enter into them. It sounds very wishy-washy to us because we have a sharp divide between ourselves and the world around us, which we believe our senses represent to us. We do not engage with the things in themselves, and nothing can penetrate into our subjectivity. But for an ancient person, for example, the forms, Platonic forms or Aristotelian forms, literally enter into your faculties. You're apprehending the form itself in your mind. In the same way, various supernatural realities, such as the Holy Spirit, can enter you and fill you with a love for God and a love for neighbor. Satan can tempt you, and by tempting you and you giving in, he can enter into your mind and into your heart. And so we see this in a very strong way with this revenant idea, and in later centuries, this would be picked up in the conception of witches and the witchcraft trials. I want to also just add two further things. One is that William describes Berwick as being in the domain of Scotland during this story. And indeed, for those of you who know Berwick, you'll know that it's at the very north of England, the very northeast of England. It's the furthest northern town in the whole of England. It's right under the Scottish border. But it has been Scottish and English in various times in history. I think it's 13 times it has swapped hands. And during this period, Scotland had a great king, David I. He was very strong on bringing in the Norman officials and reforms into Scotland. He expanded its territory, taking advantage of the anarchy and civil war in England. And as he did so, he established Berwick upon Tweed as a royal borough, the first royal borough in Scotland. That meant it could trade internationally. It didn't just have to trade in Scotland, it could trade with merchants in England, in Scandinavia, on the continent. And indeed, Berwick at one point would become the second largest economic centre in medieval Britain, only second to London. It had great trade networks. It was on the River Tweed, so it had a strong salmon fishing tradition. It was perfect for navigating across the borders area. It was a really a hub of a lot of activity, a meeting point at the border. So that's an interesting aspect of this. Finally, though, I want to draw attention to what William was saying towards the end of that passage, which was about how, we can't, if you didn't have all of this evidence, it'd be difficult to believe in the existence of revenants. It's easy to think that medieval people were gullible, that they just believed in lots of superstitions because they were irrational, they weren't educated, they didn't have a modern understanding of the world, modern rules of science. But William was an intelligent man. He was quite willing to criticize the methodology and results of Geoffrey of Monmouth's historical research. Albeit he wasn't criticizing him for having magical elements. Rather, it was that one should have to prove their case. And William is saying something similar here. It's by and large, we would not expect such stories to be true. The dead do not generally rise and cause havoc in our towns. And he makes a further really interesting point that as far as he knows, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. This is something that's happening in medieval Britain and perhaps in Europe as well, but it's not something which he's found in many ancient sources. And so he's saying the main reason to believe this is happening is there are many tales in this period. Now, is he being sarcastic? Is he kind of saying this to make you really see what he's actually saying is, no, there's no such things? Or does he genuinely believe in revenants? I'll leave that up to you as the reader. I find it interesting that he sees it as a relatively recent, or for his day, a present phenomenon, that this isn't something which affected the past and maybe represents a sense of crisis within medieval England, medieval Britain, certainly with the anarchy, the breakdown of social and political order, leading to chaos, to the destruction of life in many towns and communities, cruelty reigning the land, bands of robbers moving about. This is kind of like end time stuff. And so the coming back of the dead to haunt people would be the sort of thing that would happen in the total collapse of the social order, of the natural order, we might say as well. Because remember, for these people, the monarch isn't just a political figurehead. Having a king, a just king, keeps everything on an even keel. It is like one pillar within a house or in a temple, let's say, and you remove this central pillar and the roof is going to collapse. And it's the same with all of these things. They're held together. The natural order is held together in a tight web of proportional relations. When social order breaks down because there's a war over who should be king, this breaks nature, it breaks the human on an individual level and on a community level. And so it's no wonder that with this dereliction of rulership, that we should see the dead coming back. It's almost like providing a window, an opening for this to take place. Everything is interconnected for these people. One thing knocks onto another. So I think that's quite interesting as potentially a comment on the ways people felt during this period. So that is a little discussion and retelling of William of Newborough's Revenant. Please put in the comments below any tales you've heard of about these creatures or undead corpses coming back to life. I'd be very interested to hear them. And what remains to say is, I hope whoever you are, whether you're listening to this on Halloween or another night, God bless you and see you soon. Bye for now.